Good morning, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion recorded on April 14th, 2023, recorded on 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the new 2023 Atlantic hurricane season predictions. So jumping straight into everything, taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this morning, all is relatively quiet. We had our Gulf flow that developed out here in the north central Gulf of Mexico and moved northward, making landfall sometime early yesterday, bringing with it some gusty winds, heavy rainfall, and some occasional severe weather out across portions of Florida and Georgia yesterday. This weather system will continue to move off generally towards the northeast over the next couple of days, brings with it some heavy rainfall and maybe an isolated, severe storm or two, especially out here closer to the Atlantic waters. Now, taking a look at the seasonal predictions, we'll first take a look at the forecasts made from last year, see how they verified. So looking at the June 1st predictions here, this is my predictions. So looking at the June 1st predictions, we were calling for about 20 named storms, just about 7 hurricanes and 4 major hurricanes. Then moved to the May outlook, we actually had to bring that number down to about 17 named storms. We still were calling for about 6 hurricanes and about 3 major hurricanes. And then this is the actual verification at the end of the season. We still ended up with less storms. I think we ended up with about 14 named storms and I think about 6 hurricanes and 2 majors. So I think 2 or 3 majors. So we ended up pretty close to the verification, although you definitely noticed that we had to downtrend and our original numbers were still too high. But irregardless, we were roughly within the ballpark of that range. So that is definitely a good sign. So jumping into the meat and potatoes of this year's 2023 Atlantic hurricane season predictions, we are forecasting 12 named storms, 4 hurricanes, and only 1 major hurricane. And this compares a little bit to Colorado State. Of course, CSU update or put out their first forecast yesterday, I think calling for about 13, 6, and 2, I believe, or 13, 4, and 2, something like that. So we're roughly within the ballpark of the CSU forecast, but ultimately the numbers are a little bit lower. And I think that is owed to, well, really the fact that we're heading into an El Nino, and we'll talk about all of that and why this forecast is what it is here in just a second. If we're looking at the risk areas for this year, again, generally speaking, this is a very low confidence forecast. Again, low confidence forecast, but generally speaking, there's a moderate threat, I do think, out here in the Caribbean, especially in the early part of the season when we're not firmly entrenched within an El Nino pattern yet. The atmosphere is going to take some time to, move into an El Nino, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But early season activity is certainly possible in the Caribbean and the island chain. Certainly, I think the highest threat, almost like every single year, is ending up in the Gulf of Mexico. Early season activity or not, if you get a cyclone that forms in the Gulf, well, it's kind of hard to not hit land unless if it just dissipates. So there's always kind of a high threat for some type of landfall risk in the Gulf of Mexico. But then elsewise in the Turks and Caicos, the Bermuda, or not Bermuda, but really Bermuda and the Bahamas, and the east coast of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and portions of southern and southwestern North Carolina, there is a moderate threat for a tropical cyclone landfall. And then up across the northeastern states, there's a low threat, Bermuda, with a moderate threat as well. So just to kind of give you some idea that a moderate threat really consists of about 40 to 60%. A low is anything under 40, and a high is anything above a 60% risk. That's what we would classify as being low, moderate, and high. So again, the highest risk, as always, is going to be the western coast of Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico, and obviously down here in really the BOC, down there in the Bay of Campeche and portions of the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, the reason for this forecast here, so this is the sea surface temperature anomaly map. This updated as of yesterday, so we're looking at the departures from average here in the water temperatures. And compare this to where we were just even several months ago. We noticed that we've seen substantial warming out here in the entire ENSO region, and mainly the Nino 3-4 index, which is this area through here. This is what's used for classifying El Nino, La Nina, or neutral conditions. And right now we are not in an El Nino, but we're certainly not in a La Nina. We are in that neutral ground right now. But we notice that the water temperatures right off the coast of South America here are, in some cases, 5 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. Now, this is a very significant departure. And typically, when we have these type of water temperatures or water temperature anomalies out here off the coast of Central America, they typically will be spreading, westward with time here. And this basically means that we're going to be seeing continued warming of the ENSO 3-4 area, meaning we're going to continue to see the atmosphere change into more of an El Nino background. El Nino, again, typically reduces the impact of the Atlantic hurricane season. We have less overall conditions as shear increases and dry air problems increase. However, there's two conflicting problems here, and the reason why the numbers aren't so bottom low with the forecasts basically from everybody. First of all, we have this very cold PDO pattern out here, basically the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, meaning we have a lot of cold air right now, or a lot of cold water temperatures that are coming from the Arctic and, well, really, coming from Alaska and the Arctic and flowing southward. And so we have all of this cold water that is kind of limiting the overall spatial extent of this warmth out here, but also it limits the ability for any tropical cyclones to really take over in the East Pacific Basin. Now, also in the Atlantic Basin, we notice that there's pretty significant warmth right now in the main development region. In some cases, water temperatures on the order of about 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. And that doesn't really look to be changing, at least in the near term. So while we're still a little too far out to determine, what these water temperatures are going to be like come August, September, October, which is the peak months of the hurricane season, if this pattern were to persist, I definitely think that the Atlantic Basin, at least in the near term, for really, let's just call it, mid-May through, let's just say, July, maybe early August, may not have substantial issues with stability and shear, but eventually I think the ENSO, the El Nino pattern is going to come about, and we're going to start to see this pattern in the Atlantic subside. So again, generally speaking, the main development region probably is going to be quiet this year, but I want to reiterate something. El Nino does not really affect the Gulf of Mexico. It affects the Caribbean and the MDR, but not the subtropics as much and not the Gulf of Mexico. So just something to kind of point out there. Now looking forward here towards the official El Nino, La Nina probabilities here. Well, practically we notice here this is August, September, October, peak of the Atlantic hurricane season. And we notice that we have just slightly above an 80% chance of seeing El Nino conditions. And that rises to almost 85% as we get into later this year, into early next year. By the winter of this year, I think we're going to be firmly entrenched within an El Nino pattern. So again, the conditions right now are looking like we're going to have a less overall favorable environment for hurricanes in the Atlantic. But again, it only takes one. Now, I also want to point this out here. This is the CFS total accumulated precipitation. This is the monthly mean anomaly here, so departures from average. And again, all of these greens in here, this is indicative of higher precipitation amounts. And again, out here in the browns and yellows, this is less precipitation. So generally speaking, we're looking for, by the time we get to August, September, October, we notice that we still have a signal here of some pretty significant precipitation anomalies above the long-term average in the main development region and in the subtropics / Gulf of Mexico. But we notice the Caribbean is pretty much almost dead shut at this point, and I think that's going to be the case for really the most long-term future. I just don't think the Caribbean is going to have a significant season this year. Doesn't mean we can't get one lone storm, but I think the subtropics are probably going to dominate this year, and potentially even the Gulf of Mexico, especially, early and late season events. Sea surface temperature anomaly coming off the CFS as well. Obviously, the warmth out here. But notice that we still have a persistent warmth out here in the North Atlantic. And what this does is actually creates a stronger ridge of high pressure out here. And so this allows for any systems out here to continue their way westward and, eventually find themselves in a more favorable environment where they don't develop out here, they do develop out here. So it is just something to kind of keep in mind as we head towards the, hurricane season. Again, we are about a month away now from the East Pacific season starting, and we're also about a month away as of tomorrow from the tropical weather outlooks resuming on the Atlantic side. So we're getting down there. We're less than 2 months away from the Atlantic hurricane season officially starting. So again, it is just always best to review your hurricane preparedness plans now. All right. So that being said, I do hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Mike O'Malley. I'll be talking to you guys again some more over the next several days.